When someone distances themselves after hurting you, it is very easy to experience that withdrawal as a verdict on your importance. You may start thinking that their decision to step away proves the relationship meant less to them than it meant to you. It can feel like their absence is silently telling you that what happened was not serious enough for them to stay, explain themselves, or make things right. That interpretation makes emotional sense, especially when you are the person left carrying the pain. But when you are dealing with someone who has strong avoidant tendencies, their withdrawal can come from a much more complicated psychological process. Distance is not always a simple sign of indifference. Sometimes it is their attempt to escape an emotional state that suddenly feels too intense for them to manage. For an avoidant person, pulling away can become a protective response when their emotional world starts feeling exposed or difficult to control. The moment they recognize that their behavior has genuinely hurt someone they care about, something inside them can become unsettled. It is not necessarily ordinary guilt that simply says, "I did something wrong, so I should apologize." Instead, it can feel like sudden exposure. They become aware that their actions have consequences, and that those consequences now require them to participate emotionally. There may be an expectation of explanation, accountability, vulnerability, and repair. All of that can feel threatening to someone who has learned to feel safest when they remain independent and emotionally self-contained. Instead of moving closer to address the damage, they may instinctively create more space, because space temporarily makes the emotional pressure feel smaller. From the outside, that behavior can look incredibly cold. You may watch someone disappear after hurting you and wonder how they can possibly be comfortable leaving things unresolved. You may think, if they understood what they did to me, why would they not come back and try to repair it? But internally, their experience may be completely different from what you are seeing. Their nervous system may be reacting to emotional overload rather than calmly making a decision about your worth. Their thoughts can become focused on reducing tension instead of resolving the relationship. They may tell themselves that stepping away will stop the situation from becoming worse. They may believe they need time to think, calm down, or regain control before they can deal with what happened. The problem is that temporary emotional relief does not automatically create long-term emotional responsibility. This creates one of the most painful misunderstandings in avoidant relationships. The distance that feels like relief to them can feel like abandonment to you. They experience space as something that lowers emotional intensity, while you experience the same space as another wound added to the original one. You may already be hurting because of what they did, and then their silence leaves you without acknowledgement, reassurance, explanation, or repair. Their withdrawal, therefore, becomes part of the injury itself. You are not simply processing what happened between you. You are also processing the fact that they are unwilling or unable to remain present while you are processing it. That can make the entire experience much more confusing, because you are searching for emotional resolution while they are searching for emotional distance. Both people are responding to the same rupture, but their nervous systems are asking for completely different things. This distinction matters because the avoidant response is often aimed more at regulating the self than repairing the relationship. Those are two completely different objectives. Repair requires a person to tolerate discomfort, listen to the other person's experience, acknowledge what they caused, accept that the conversation may be difficult, and remain engaged long enough for trust to begin rebuilding. Self-regulation, on the other hand, can prioritize immediate relief. It asks, how can I make this uncomfortable feeling stop, rather than, what does this relationship need from me right now? If someone has not developed the emotional capacity to stay present under pressure, withdrawal becomes an easy answer. They step away, their immediate anxiety decreases, and their mind interprets that reduction in intensity as evidence that distancing was the right choice. Yet the unresolved problem remains exactly where it was. There is another reason this can happen. For someone with avoidant tendencies, closeness may never feel completely separate from risk. Intimacy can bring comfort, but it can also create a fear of losing independence, becoming emotionally dependent, being overwhelmed, or being seen too deeply. When everything is going well, those fears may remain quiet enough to manage. But once conflict enters the relationship, closeness carries an additional burden. Now intimacy is connected to accountability. Being close means facing the person they hurt. It means hearing emotions they may not know how to handle. It means admitting that their behavior had an impact. It means allowing another person to see their imperfections without immediately escaping the situation. If their emotional capacity is limited, that level of exposure can feel overwhelming. So they protect themselves from discomfort, even though there is no actual physical danger requiring protection. And this is where the painful irony appears. The strategy they use to protect themselves from losing control can create the very disconnection they fear. They withdraw because closeness feels dangerous, but the withdrawal damages closeness. They avoid the difficult conversation because they fear making things worse, yet avoiding the conversation often makes the wound deeper. They tell themselves that they need space before they can handle the situation, but if that space continues indefinitely, there may eventually be nothing left to repair. The tragedy is not necessarily that they feel nothing. Sometimes the tragedy is that whatever they feel cannot be translated into the kind of behavior the relationship actually needs. They may care internally while behaving in ways that communicate the opposite. And for the person receiving that behavior, the distinction becomes almost impossible to live with, because relationships are experienced through actions, not through feelings that remain hidden. This is why you should be careful about turning their withdrawal into a statement about your value. Their distance may reveal something important about their emotional capacity, their coping mechanisms, and their ability to tolerate responsibility, but it does not automatically tell you how valuable you are. Someone can care about you and still lack the emotional maturity required to maintain a healthy connection with you. Someone can regret hurting you and still fail to apologize. Someone can miss you and still remain absent. Someone can recognize your importance and still choose the behavior that pushes you further away. Understanding that distinction can help you stop personalizing every act of withdrawal, but understanding it does not mean you should excuse the behavior. There is a major difference between explaining why someone behaves a certain way and deciding that their behavior is acceptable simply because you understand where it comes from. That difference becomes especially important when you realize that their internal struggle does not remove the impact on you. Perhaps they are overwhelmed. Perhaps they are frightened by emotional confrontation. Perhaps they are experiencing guilt they do not know how to process. Perhaps they genuinely believe distance is preventing further damage. None of those possibilities erase what you experience on the other side. You still have unanswered questions. You still have emotions that need acknowledgement. You still have a relationship rupture that requires some form of resolution. Compassion for another person's limitations should never require you to abandon your own emotional needs. You can understand why someone withdraws and still recognize that their withdrawal is harmful. You can have empathy without making yourself responsible for carrying the entire relationship. There is also a deeper emotional experience that can develop inside the avoidant person after they realize they have hurt you. That experience is guilt, but it is often a very different kind of guilt from the healthy remorse that motivates someone to repair what they damaged. Healthy guilt can sound like, I know I hurt you, and I need to take responsibility for that. Unresolved guilt can become, I am a terrible person, and I do not know how to face what I have done. That difference may seem small, but psychologically it can lead to completely different behavior. One version encourages movement toward the injured person, the other encourages retreat. If the person becomes consumed by shame or self-protection, they may focus so heavily on escaping their own discomfort that they never reach the point where they can meaningfully address yours. This can be particularly difficult for someone who has built an identity around being controlled, independent, and emotionally contained. Realizing that they have caused significant pain can challenge that identity. They may not want to see themselves as someone who hurts others. They may struggle with the contradiction between how they believe they are and what their actions have actually produced. Rather than sitting with that contradiction, they may create explanations that make distance feel reasonable. They might tell themselves that returning would only create more confusion, that you would misunderstand them, or that they are simply not capable of giving you what you need. Some of these thoughts may contain pieces of truth, but they can also become psychological shields that protect them from having to face the emotional consequences of their actions. Distance then starts looking like responsibility when it is actually avoidance wearing a more acceptable disguise. Real accountability works differently. Accountability does not mean disappearing because you are ashamed of what you did. It means remaining present long enough to acknowledge the impact you created. It means accepting that the other person may be hurt, angry, disappointed, or uncertain. It means resisting the urge to escape simply because the conversation is uncomfortable. This is exactly the emotional territory that avoidant patterns can make difficult. A person may understand intellectually that they should repair the situation, while emotionally feeling a powerful urge to retreat from it. That internal contradiction can leave them frozen. They know something needs to happen, but the discomfort associated with doing it feels greater than their current ability to tolerate. So they postpone. Then they postpone again. Eventually, postponement becomes distance, and distance becomes a pattern. The important thing to understand is that guilt does not necessarily disappear just because someone leaves. In many cases, it can remain quietly active underneath the withdrawal. It may return during moments of solitude, when distractions disappear and memories become more noticeable. They may remember conversations, recognize moments where they behaved poorly, or think about the way things ended. But instead of allowing those thoughts to motivate repair, they can become further evidence for staying away. The person may think, "I already made such a mess of this. What could I possibly say now?" The longer they remain silent, the more intimidating contact can become. Their own absence creates a growing emotional barrier that makes returning feel increasingly difficult. Avoidance therefore feeds itself. The longer they avoid the problem, the harder the problem feels to approach. From your perspective, this can be extremely confusing because guilt usually means something different to you. You may assume that if someone feels bad about hurting you, eventually they will reach out. You may expect an apology, an explanation, a conversation, or some visible attempt to make things better. In a healthier emotional pattern, guilt can indeed lead to those behaviors. But feeling remorse internally does not guarantee that someone knows how to convert remorse into responsible action. That is one of the hardest lessons in this dynamic. A person can experience powerful emotions and still behave in ways that leave you completely unsupported. Internal emotion is not the same thing as relational capacity. A person may feel everything and still do nothing. They may think constantly about the relationship while remaining silent. They may regret their actions while continuing the very behavior that keeps the relationship broken. This is why unresolved guilt can sometimes be more confusing than an obvious lack of feeling. If someone clearly does not care, the situation eventually becomes easier to understand. Painful, yes, but understandable. You can recognize the absence and begin grieving it. But when there appears to be emotion underneath the silence, your mind keeps searching for an explanation. You may wonder whether the person will eventually return. You may look for small signs that their feelings are still present. You may replay old conversations and interpret every detail. You may tell yourself that their silence is temporary because they are struggling internally, and this can keep you emotionally attached to a possibility rather than responding to the reality in front of you. The relationship becomes suspended between what might exist inside them and what they are actually willing to do in real life. Eventually, that uncertainty can start affecting your own perception. You may question whether you are expecting too much. You may wonder if asking for communication, accountability, or reassurance is somehow unreasonable. You may begin explaining their behavior to yourself so often that you stop noticing what the behavior is doing to you. This is where empathy can quietly become self-abandonment. Understanding another person's psychology is valuable, but it should not require you to ignore your own experience. Their reasons may explain the silence, but they do not transform silence into communication. Their fear may explain withdrawal, but it does not turn withdrawal into repair. Their guilt may explain why they struggle to return, but it does not create the relationship you need. At some point, the reason behind someone's behavior becomes less important than whether they are willing to change the behavior itself. That brings you to an uncomfortable but necessary truth. Guilt that never becomes responsibility cannot repair a relationship. Regret that remains entirely internal does not rebuild trust. Thinking about the damage does not undo the damage. Missing someone does not create emotional safety. A person can process everything privately and still leave the other person carrying the entire emotional burden alone. This is why you cannot build a stable relationship around what someone might be feeling internally. You need something observable. You need communication, consistency, accountability, and behavior that demonstrates a willingness to participate. Without those things, you are left trying to interpret invisible emotions while living with very visible consequences, and that is an exhausting place to remain. There is another layer that makes avoidant withdrawal particularly difficult to understand. The connection does not necessarily disappear for them simply because they stop communicating with you. Distance can change the form of their connection to you without eliminating the emotional significance altogether. This is where a painful contradiction can appear. They may miss you and still never come back. For many people, missing someone naturally creates movement. You feel their absence, you become uncomfortable with the distance, and eventually you reach out because the desire for reconnection outweighs the discomfort. But for someone who relies heavily on emotional avoidance, longing and action do not always travel together. They may experience the longing privately while remaining completely still externally. They may think about you during quiet moments. They may remember conversations that seemed insignificant at the time, but later become emotionally meaningful. They may replay certain experiences and recognize that the relationship mattered more than they admitted while they were inside it. They may feel the absence of your presence in their life. None of that necessarily means they will contact you. The same emotional system that created the withdrawal can remain active even while they miss you. They may still fear vulnerability, They may still feel embarrassed about what happened. They may still believe that reconnecting would force them to confront everything they have been avoiding. So the desire for closeness becomes trapped behind the fear of what closeness would require. They feel the pull, but they also feel the danger associated with acting on it. Over time, that longing can become something that exists primarily in thought. Instead of moving toward you, they revisit you mentally. Instead of asking how you are, they remember how you made them feel. Instead of having a real conversation, they imagine conversations that never happen. This creates a strange emotional substitute for connection. The person can maintain an internal relationship with the memory of you without having to face the responsibilities of a real relationship with you. In their mind, there is no immediate conflict, no difficult response to anticipate, and no demand to explain themselves. Memory becomes easier than reality because memory does not require participation. It allows them to feel something without exposing themselves to the consequences of acting on that feeling. That is also where idealization can begin. Once someone is removed from your everyday life, the mind can gradually soften the difficult parts of the relationship. Arguments become less vivid. Tension loses some of its emotional intensity. The painful details can fade, while meaningful moments become more prominent. The person may begin remembering the connection through a more emotionally comfortable lens. You may become associated with something special, rare, comforting, or deeply significant. But even idealizing someone does not necessarily create the courage to reconnect with them. In fact, sometimes the opposite happens. The more emotionally meaningful the person becomes in memory, the more intimidating real contact can feel. Returning means discovering whether reality matches the internal version they have been carrying, and that uncertainty can feel threatening. This creates another painful imbalance between the two people. You are dealing with what actually happened. You remember the words, the silence, the rupture, the things that were left unresolved, and the questions that never received answers. They may be dealing primarily with an internal representation of the relationship. They remember feelings, moments, possibilities, and memories that can exist without demanding anything from them. You are standing in reality while they are standing inside memory. Reality asks for accountability. Memory does not. Reality asks what happens next. Memory allows someone to remain inside what happened before. That is why their private emotional connection to you may feel very real, while still producing no meaningful change in your life. From your side, love and care are usually measured through presence, effort, communication, and the willingness to stay engaged when things become difficult. So when someone remains silent despite apparently caring, it is completely natural to interpret that silence as evidence that you did not matter enough. But another possibility is that what you represented mattered deeply, while simultaneously requiring more emotional capacity than they currently possess. Those two truths can exist together. You can be important to someone and still be someone they cannot presently maintain a healthy relationship with. That is painful because importance without capacity does not create security. It may explain their behavior, but it does not give you the relationship you deserve. This is why it becomes essential to distinguish between emotional significance and relational availability. Someone can feel strongly about you without being capable of showing up consistently. Someone can recognize your value without knowing how to protect the relationship. Someone can miss you without having the courage or skills to reconnect responsibly. Those feelings may be genuine, but genuineness alone is not enough. A relationship needs participation. It needs two people who are willing to bring their internal experiences into the shared space between them. If one person keeps everything inside, the other person is left trying to build a relationship from clues. That is not stability, it is uncertainty, and prolonged uncertainty slowly damages emotional trust. You may therefore find yourself trapped in a cycle of waiting. You tell yourself that perhaps they need more time. Maybe they will eventually understand what they lost. Maybe the distance will make them realize what the relationship meant. Maybe their feelings will eventually become stronger than their fear. But none of those possibilities should become the foundation of your life. Time does not automatically create emotional maturity. Distance does not automatically produce clarity. Missing someone does not automatically create the ability to repair a relationship. A person can remain internally conflicted for a very long time without ever developing the capacity to behave differently. That is why waiting indefinitely for someone's internal process to produce external change can keep you emotionally stuck. When you bring the pieces together, you begin to see the deeper pattern. There is distance, there is guilt, there is longing, and there is silence. But underneath all of it is an internal conflict between wanting connection and fearing what connection requires. One side of the person may genuinely want closeness. They may want affection, emotional safety, companionship, and the reassurance of being connected to someone who matters. At the same time, another side may fear vulnerability, dependence, confrontation, accountability, and the possibility of being overwhelmed by emotional demands. These two forces do not simply cancel one another out. They can exist simultaneously, creating a constant push and pull inside the person. The desire for connection is real, but so is the fear that comes with allowing that connection to become emotionally significant. So when they hurt you and then retreat, what you are witnessing may not be a simple, calm decision to stop caring. It may be an unresolved internal conflict that they manage by creating distance. One part of them knows that something important has been damaged. Another part believes that getting closer will only create more emotional pressure. Instead of resolving those opposing feelings, they step away from the entire situation. They create physical or emotional distance because distance gives them a temporary sense of control. The problem is that containment is not resolution. Putting an emotional problem somewhere out of sight does not make that problem disappear. It simply means the person does not have to confront it immediately, and what is avoided today often becomes even more difficult to face tomorrow. The cycle can continue even after the relationship has gone quiet. Their feelings may resurface when they are alone, when life becomes less distracting, or when something unexpectedly reminds them of you. They may suddenly feel the desire to reconnect. They may remember what was good and wonder whether they made a mistake. They may experience a genuine emotional pull toward you, but almost immediately, the other side of the conflict can appear. They remember what happened. They remember the pain they caused. They imagine the questions you might ask. They anticipate the vulnerability required to return. They may wonder whether you are angry, whether you still care, whether you would reject them, or whether returning would force them to confront parts of themselves they would rather avoid. The longing is real, but so is the resistance. That is why they can appear emotionally suspended between two directions. They are not necessarily completely detached, but they are also not moving toward you. They may not feel fully finished with the relationship internally, yet they are still absent externally. From your perspective, that middle state is incredibly difficult because you are looking for a clear answer. You want to know whether the relationship matters or does not matter, whether they care or do not care, whether they are coming back or moving on. But an avoidant pattern can create a situation where those questions do not have clean emotional answers. Someone can care and withdraw. Someone can miss you and remain silent. Someone can regret hurting you and still avoid the conversation. The contradiction is not necessarily proof that you imagined the connection. It may be evidence of their internal inconsistency. Most people naturally connect feelings with behavior. If someone loves you, you expect them to move closer. If they value you, you expect effort. If they regret hurting you, you expect an apology. Those expectations are reasonable because healthy relationships require some connection between what a person feels and what they do. But avoidant patterns can interrupt that connection. A feeling may arise internally and then get blocked before it becomes behavior. A desire for closeness may immediately activate fear. A sense of guilt may trigger shame rather than accountability. A wish to reconnect may be followed by the thought that staying away is safer. This creates a gap between internal experience and external behavior, and the person on the receiving end is left trying to understand why the two do not match. That gap is exactly what makes these relationships so difficult to release emotionally. If the other person were completely indifferent, there would eventually be less ambiguity. You would know that the relationship was over because there was no movement, no emotion, and no desire to reconnect. But when there are occasional signs of feeling, memories, mixed signals, or moments of apparent emotional awareness, your mind keeps looking for the missing piece. It starts asking whether there is still hope. Maybe they just need time. Maybe they are afraid. Maybe they will realize what they lost. Maybe they are secretly struggling. The problem is that possibility can become a place where you live indefinitely. You can spend months or years interpreting someone's internal conflict while receiving very little actual relationship from them. Time itself does not necessarily solve this pattern. Sometimes people assume that enough distance will naturally produce perspective and eventually bring someone back with greater clarity. But emotional patterns do not automatically disappear because the calendar moves forward. In some cases, prolonged distance can make avoidance more comfortable. The longer someone remains away, the more familiar that distance becomes. Their nervous system learns that staying away reduces pressure. Returning becomes associated with increasingly complicated emotions, unanswered questions, and the possibility of rejection or confrontation. Instead of becoming easier, reconnecting may feel harder because the emotional gap has grown. Silence can therefore become self-perpetuating. Every day of silence makes the next day of silence easier, even while the unresolved feelings remain underneath. This is why internal conflict should never be confused with guaranteed transformation. A person can be deeply conflicted and still remain exactly where they are. Awareness does not automatically create maturity. Regret does not automatically create responsibility. Longing does not automatically create courage. Understanding the problem does not automatically give someone the skills required to solve it. What matters is whether the internal experience eventually becomes visible behavior. Does the person communicate differently? Do they take responsibility? Do they acknowledge the damage? Do they make a consistent effort to rebuild trust? Do they remain present when the relationship becomes uncomfortable? Those are the things that show genuine movement. Without them, internal struggle remains internal, and you cannot build a secure relationship around something you can only imagine is happening inside another person. So the most useful question is not simply whether they are struggling emotionally. They may very well be. The more important question is what their struggle produces in real life. Does it move them toward accountability, communication, and repair? Or does it repeatedly send them back into silence and distance? If the same pattern keeps ending with withdrawal, then the emotional conflict is not creating resolution. It is simply reproducing the same cycle. They feel pressure, they retreat, the pressure decreases, they feel safer, the relationship remains unresolved, and eventually the feelings return. Then the emotional pull becomes strong again, but the fear of returning activates, and the person withdraws once more. The cycle can continue for as long as the underlying emotional capacity remains unchanged. And this is where your own position becomes important. You do not need to deny that they may have feelings. You do not need to convince yourself that they never cared. You do not need to rewrite the entire relationship as meaningless just because their behavior was inconsistent. But you also do not need to build your future around what they might eventually feel, realize, or do. Their internal world belongs to them. Their healing belongs to them. Their emotional development belongs to them. Your responsibility is to decide what you are willing to accept in your own life. If someone needs distance to regulate themselves, they are allowed to take that distance. But you are also allowed to stop waiting inside that distance for them to become ready. Their limitations do not have to become your permanent emotional environment. Understanding avoidant psychology should therefore give you clarity, not another reason to remain attached. You can recognize that their withdrawal may come from fear rather than cruelty, and still choose not to participate in the consequences of that fear. You can acknowledge that they may miss you without treating that possibility as a promise. You can accept that they may feel guilty without waiting for their guilt to become an apology. You can understand that they may remember you fondly without assuming that memory means they are capable of building something healthy with you. Compassion becomes useful when it helps you see reality more clearly. It becomes harmful when it persuades you to tolerate indefinite uncertainty because you are always trying to understand the person who is not showing up.